Okay, so this is where we left off the other day. We were talking about all these different major topics in developmental psychology and lifespan psychology, and how not all of them should be viewed as either-or questions. But we have continuity and discontinuity, and I gave the example of my son Camden learning how to swim. There he is at age 2, at age 9, and this isn't something that changes in a completely new way with every stage of development. It gradually builds, so this would be continuous. It would be something that's would fall into a continuity theory, you know, and then eventually becoming a professional swimmer, right? Another major topic then in lifespan development for years has been the nature versus nurture issue. And that is what I asked you guys to do your reading on in the context of gender differences. And to define, you probably already know this, but defining nature and nurture, these terms, nature is anything that has to do with that organism's biological inheritance, their genes, their DNA, right? So it's in their hardwiring, it's things they've inherited from their parents, right? And then we have this term called maturation, where because of the genetic code, these things fall into place as the child is growing and developing. And it's coming about as a result of that growth and development, okay? So a lot of it has to do with brain maturation. You'll hear me talk about that a lot throughout the quarter. We'll say, oh, you know, why can't a 3-year-old coordinate his, you know, his eye to his large motor muscle movements when he's trying to hit a ball, like if he's learning how to play t-ball? Well, we would say because his brain maturation isn't there yet. That will come with time. Nurture, then, is any environmental experience. A lot of developmental psychologists today also include things that are happening in the womb prenatally as being environmental influences, because the mother could be taking substances in, you know, through either her diet or breathing toxins in the air or smoking cigarettes or, you know, in any number of ways that something's coming into her body. That is something externally being introduced to her body that's then going to cross the placenta possibly and could alter the developing fetus, right? So in some ways, we even have environmental influences before birth, right? And of course, we know certain toxins are dangerous for the developing fetus, like alcohol, certainly smoking and other drugs like that. Other things we're not quite sure what the exact safe level is. You know, like caffeine is one of those. I'm like, well, caffeine seems to be pretty safe, but let's not go crazy. Let's not have more than, say, 5 cups of coffee a day. And actually, most obstetricians would say, let's have maybe 1 cup of coffee to play it safe. There's a correlation between high caffeine consumption and miscarriage, but not a lot of studies. There's only 2 or 3 studies showing that. And alcohol is the same thing. Like, we don't know, there's no known safe level, but because of fetal alcohol syndrome, it's best to maybe just completely stay away from it, right? So when we're looking at then after the baby is born, how much of the course of their development is due to these things that they've inherited, their genetic code, and we'll talk about that next week. You have about 20,000 genes that you know, you receive in combination from your mother and father. Those genes are lying on your chromosomes. And then how much is coming from the actual experiences in the environment. And that, of course, is going to include the child's diet, but as well as things that are told to them, cultural influences, all of those things in their environment. So our question then that we're focusing on right now is specifically looking at gender differences. And I chose this topic because it's pretty broad. There's lots of different opinions out there. It's changed considerably since the 1950s, 1960s, when really we thought gender was absolutely from the environment. It's just because behaviorism was such a dominant force in psychology at the time. And then, of course, we have the case of the John versus Joan that you guys watched the video, the boy who was turned into a girl, right? So that's one really, really important case study that you should kind of just know and have under your belt, because psychologists and readings that you get throughout the course of your career in psychology often refer to the John Joan case. And you might ask, well, why did they call it the John Joan case when it was Bruce turned into Brenda? It's because Dr. John Money wrote his book and kept their names anonymous and called it John and Joan. That's why. But I gave you a couple other articles as well, so we will talk about that. I'm going to pause this. All right, so clearly it can't be totally all nature or totally all nurture. Nothing acts in a vacuum. You have them interacting, right? It's bidirectional. Epigenetics is an up-and-coming field that is essentially studying this second layer on the genome, and we'll talk about that more next week. But your genome is your entire instruction, your entire packet of instructions, right? All 20,000 or so genes, and then the epigenome are, those protein tags that some people had mentioned, and they can silence or activate genes. So this field of study falls in really well with developmental psychology, because we can go, okay, not everything is set in stone. Your DNA isn't necessarily your destiny. Certain things, it's difficult to change your personality, but you can change your behaviors, or you can certainly change your health. Things can be impacted through what kind of lifestyle you engage in, right? If you exercise and stay away from drugs and smoking cigarettes and that kind of thing, right? So you're not necessarily going to develop cancer. If you have been tested and you got a cancer gene, you may not necessarily develop cancer because of epigenetics, of this ability to alter the genome. So that's another aspect that then makes developmental psychology multidisciplinary, because now we have neuroscientists that are studying the same questions that we're studying, certainly on a different level, on a neuro level. Yeah, go ahead.
Are epigenetics will be passed on through influence as well? Because I was showing documentary about scientists were claiming that the behaviors of your parents are being stored in their DNA and they pass it on to you.
Yeah, possibly, especially during those critical periods like pregnancy. So your mother ate hopefully a healthy diet while she was pregnant, and but that changed the methyl groups on your DNA that you got from the sperm and the egg from your mom and dad. But then her diet as she was pregnant may have silenced or activated right away, even prenatally. But then also that her epigenetics obviously then were affected by her mother when she was in her womb. So yeah, in that sense, it can be passed down. That's why I'm like, oh my gosh, good thing that my grandparents were weren't drinkers and smokers. They actually were farmers, so they grew and ate their own food. I'm going, wow, I probably, in my inheritance, there's probably actually a lot healthier than what they were ahead of their time in a way, but it's because they were really poor, right? So they had to grow their own food. The human body is pretty amazing in protecting that developing fetus. Yeah, one more question?
So if your grandparents are heavy alcoholics during your, say, like my mom's pregnancy, and then but she turned out okay, and then my mom never drank at all, so could I still have like possible problems
Well, it's maybe more likely that you could have inherited a gene that makes you susceptible to alcoholism. There are some genes that they've identified that might make you susceptible in maybe how you metabolize alcohol or how your brain's reward system responds to it. So you might be more prone to addiction, but it's, you've got it a generation away. So, and same thing with your mother. She might have inherited one of those genes as well. The thing is, just like anything in epigenetics, it has to be triggered. So you have to drink the alcohol to trigger it, right? So, but I think it's important to realize those things about your ancestors, because then you can be more cognizant of your behaviors. You can go, wow, I don't really know my DNA, right? We don't know, getting your entire epigenome sequenced is really expensive, right? And a normal average citizen doesn't have that done, right? So I don't know if I have those genes. Scientists don't even know maybe what all those genes are responsible for, right? But because I know that this thing is in my family, I might be more susceptible to it. So I'm going to be cautious in my behaviors, type of thing, right? As far as during the pregnancy, that's also a question that maybe is unknown. Let's move on, and because I want to get through the theories, and I have another activity I want us to do. The major theoretical perspectives. Okay, so in your textbook, Feldman has categorized these in this fashion. Other lifespan textbooks that you pick up may have a couple of them slightly moved around or labeled a little bit differently, or even additional ones in there. He's got humanistic theory as being a major theoretical perspective for lifespan, which I don't entirely agree with. Humanistic theory is really a personality theory, really applies to self-concept and that kind of development, and doesn't hit all of the different domains that we talked about, like biological and cognitive. It's not really hitting the whole big picture. So we don't usually use humanistic theory in lifespan development too often, but I put this slide up here just so that you can see these are the areas that Feldman has highlighted. Psychodynamic, obviously we've got Freud and Erikson, and I'll go through each of these in a little bit of detail today. Behaviorism, huge force during the 20th century and still used in many ways. Cognitive, our primary person there is Jean Piaget. Humanistic, of course, is Maslow and Rogers. Contextual, we have a couple new names that maybe you haven't studied before, and we'll get to that. Urie Bronfenbrenner is sort of the one that I think of right offhand. And then evolutionary, of course, we've got Charles Darwin, and then maybe you haven't heard of Konrad Lorenz. We'll talk about him. Okay, so psychoanalytic theory. And actually, let me hand out an outline for you. So I'm just introducing these theories today, and I'm not going to go into them in great depth because every week we'll keep kind of returning to them, especially the stage theories, where they have something happens during infancy, and we'll address the different perspectives and what those theorists' viewpoints were within that age period that we're studying that week. Okay, so psychoanalytic theory, we're talking about the unconscious, right? So our two major theorists are Sigmund Freud and Erik Erikson. Okay? Everybody studies Sigmund Freud, right? Right? So Sigmund Freud's psychosexual theory and Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory. Right? These gentlemen were contemporaries. Erikson came along a little bit later than Freud, but there's some major differences, but they really do both look at the unconscious as being a primary force in driving one's development. Okay, so this should be review for you guys, right? You took Psych 100 hopefully not too long ago. We've got our psychosexual stages, and you know that contemporary psychologists do not use Freud's theory in the same way today that he originally wrote it, especially that phallic stage, which has been largely discredited. There's just really not any scientific evidence behind it. Nonetheless, it's pretty interesting, and it is based on observation. Freud had some pretty keen observations of children. But we go from the oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, latency, and genital stage. Okay? And then he stopped. His theory, he says, oh, okay, you've gone through puberty, you're fully developed. And we know, of course, that lots of changes occur after puberty. And, here's my little depiction of the phallic stage, which was Freud's, his theory of gender development. He said that during that the lifespan of 3 to 6 years old, maybe a little bit old, maybe even up to about age 7, the child is gaining pleasure from focusing on their genitals, right? So they will self-stimulate, masturbate. The nerve endings are all there, right? But at the same time, they also are understanding that, hey, I'm a girl, or hey, I'm a boy. And what's that? Where's her penis? See this little boy here? He's looking down. He's like, "Where's her penis?" I don't know. And he said that during this phase, there's a conflict that arises, and so the little boys have what's called an Oedipus complex, where they have this unconscious jealous love for their mother, and they hate their father. But then they're afraid their father's going to kill them, so they realize it's self-defeating, so they come to identify with the role model of their father and copy him and follow him around the house with this little toolbox and whatever male things dad is doing. Little girl has something called the Electra complex, where kind of the same thing. She has this unconscious jealous love for her father, and realizes it's self-defeating, and then copies mom. Okay? And Freud did say that this was, coming from society then. So the parents need to be the appropriate role models. And this has been really discredited, right? Because there's an awful lot of kids that were raised in a home with only one parent, and they didn't have the same-sex role model in their home, and they grew up to be masculine and, fall into society or just naturally gravitate towards their interests. So it's really been discredited. But at the same time, it's a pretty interesting theory in his observations in how children do sort of focus on the mouth at birth. They're putting stuff in their mouth, they're exploring the world with their mouth. And then you've got, potty training going on in the anal stage. The 3-4-year-old all of a sudden realizes they have these body parts that are different than some other kids. And they get really rigid in what boys are like and what girls are like, right? Quentin looks at the toy catalog before Christmas, and he sees a toy that he wants, and then he realizes it's in the girl section, and he goes, "Aw, never mind." And then that kind of breaks my heart, because I'm like, no, you just circle whatever you want. You don't worry about those pink borders on the page. You just tell Santa what you want. But that's coming from society, right? So that kind of gets back to the nature-nurture too. Latency, the sexuality quiets down. Now the child is focusing on becoming a little citizen. And then genital stage, that's really puberty is kicking in. Now the masturbation is masturbation, right? Okay, so Erik Erikson was different in a number of ways. First of all, there was not a sexual focus. It was a social focus. And it's a lifespan theory. His wife, Joan Erikson, worked with him side by side, and there they are. And his real name was Erich Homburg, but being a Jew in Nazi Germany, needed to get out of there. And so he got out of there, came to the United States, changed his name to Erik Erikson. A lot of Jews changed their name because of all the discrimination that they were faced with. And he did teach at Harvard. One of my professors at Boston University was actually his TA. That's how old my professor is. My professor is like, oh gosh, I bet he's 75 years old, maybe close to 80 now. So he was actually one of his TAs, so it's kind of cool, and worked with him. So this theory we will touch back on every stage as we go through our textbook and talk about how there's a crisis with every stage of development. The crisis has to be resolved in order to effectively move on to the next stage. Now the thing is, and that's the moral that needs and satisfied, not overindulged, in order to move on to the next stage. The thing is, the child keeps growing and getting older, right? So you're going to get older no matter what, but if you get stuck somewhere, it could cause some psychological problems, emotional problems, or social problems. That's why it's called the psychosocial stages of development, moving on later in life. And we've even have interesting research studies looking at, like in the trust versus mistrust stage in infancy, when you're coming to trust your caregiver, and it creates an attachment with your caregiver. If that's not established early on in life, but then you keep growing and develop and moving on, when you hit early adulthood, intimacy versus isolation, and now it's time for you to find a life partner, they find that people who didn't establish trust in their caregivers have difficulty establishing trust in life partners. And so it does kind of make sense that even though you keep getting older and the years keep going by, if something happened along the way, it's going to cause problems for you. Just like any stage theory, though, we as contemporary psychologists understand that it's not quite as rigid as these theorists first wrote them to be, right? There's probably a lot more flexibility and changes that go along. I mean, he's really pretty specific in, 1 to 3 years, 3 to 5 years, et cetera. Okay. Of the cognitive theories, the really prominent, important psychologist that we study is Jean Piaget. And Piaget was a Swiss psychologist. All of his original books are written in French, and they've been translated, and there's a few things have been lost in translation, and I'll kind of try to clarify some of that over the weeks. But really, really influential for child development in particular, and implications for education, for our education system. Information processing approaches and cognitive neuroscience. I probably won't spend a ton of time on those. Information processing is kind of like your memory stage model, where information comes in. Your brain's kind of like a computer. The information comes in, you process it, and you spit it out. Cognitive neuroscience, now we have the help of imaging and using other tools to determine, how a person is developing. All right, so we'll go through all the different stages of Piaget week by week. His theory was discontinuous, right? So we talked about continuity versus discontinuity. It's really a discontinuity theorist because it's qualitatively different with each stage. Yes, of course, in some ways you're building, but he said with each stage there's a switch, a change. And cognitive means thinking, right? So it's the way the child is thinking. It changes in a meaningful way with every stage of development. And he did say that they were age-related. And we can critique him about, his methodology. These are his two daughters. Most of his theory was originally written based off of interactions with his daughters. And this is back in like the 1930s. And I'd say, well, 2 test subjects is kind of a reach, right, to generalize to all children everywhere. But he did work with other kids. This is him later in his life. And I will show you in a couple of weeks, when we get to early childhood, some videos of children doing the same experiments that these kids in maybe the 1960s here are doing, and the same experiments that he did on his daughters in the 30s. And the kids give the same responses. So that just makes me go, okay, Piaget, you really were onto something. Children think in predictable ways based on their age, and based on then that brain maturation is what we can infer from that. So it's really fun to do the experiments. If you have your own children, you can do the experiments on your children and see how they respond. And of course, I've experimented on my kids. Yes. Yes. Hiding the object, and the baby doesn't know that they don't realize that it still exists underneath the blanket, right? Okay, so it's qualitatively different with each stage. So it's really a 4-stage theory: sensory, motor, pre-operational, concrete, and then formal operational. But his also wasn't a lifespan theory. He said, okay, once that individual reaches adolescence and they're able to do hypothetical deductive reasoning and think logically, they can problem solve, they can do algebra, they can figure out puzzles, really adult-like type of thinking. But we now know that there is more to cognitive development after adolescence. There's another switch that takes place, and maybe some people don't ever reach it. And that's what I think college does for people, is that you get that switch, that final, maturation of the brain, where you stop going, okay, there's an answer to everything. You start to realize that there are multiple possibilities, and your thinking becomes more reflective and expansive, and that's basically applying critical thinking. So maybe Piaget didn't give children enough credit, but I still think that he was incredibly influential, and he's one of my favorites. Okay, behavioral theories. So we've studied this in Psych 100, and you may have studied it in other classes as well. But we hit on 3 main people here. John B. Watson with the classical conditioning. Remember, he conditioned little Albert to fear all fuzzy things? Yeah. So essentially pairing a stimulus with something that you want to teach the child, and they come to learn that behavior just because it's been presented over and over again together. That's classical conditioning. B.F. Skinner did operant conditioning, where it has to do with consequences. So the antecedents plus the behaviors equal the consequences. And of course, we learned from him that usually reinforcement is the best way to shape a person's behavior or an animal's behavior versus punishment. Punishment is usually short-lived, can be effective in the immediate moment, but really reinforcement tends to be the way to go, to encourage the types of behaviors you want to see. And then Albert Bandura's social learning theory, and what was his famous study? Bobo, right? The Bobo doll, learning through observation, modeling, right? So Really, it's very environmental, right? All of these things, behaviorism is largely looking at how the environment is shaping development, is shaping behavior. Okay, and then the humanistic perspective is not used nearly as much in human development and in lifespan psychology. It's really more of a personality theory, but how can an individual, it's a motivation theory and theory of personality as well, Maslow and Rogers. Remember this? The hierarchy of basic needs, this is Maslow. So you have to provide the individual with their basic physiological needs first and build up the pyramid. If you expect them to achieve any goal and reach their full potential, you have to provide all these things at the bottom of the pyramid first. And caregivers, parents do this early in life. We could maybe match this theory up with Erikson and go, okay, well, we're establishing trust by giving those physiological needs. But along with that, we're also showing that we care and love for this child, and that's fostering esteem. And then as they go out into the world, they achieve their different goals and reach success, and then maybe reach self-actualization or transcend outside themselves. And Carl Rogers used that theory as well when he was talking about the self-concept being developed. Yes? Mm-hmm.
And there's probably just a handful of people that actually do. And he said we were joking about how a lot of them probably aren't going to do that because of all the distractions and stuff like that, and how we're never truly satisfied.
Right. We live in a culture that perpetually dissatisfies us. You need a better car. Well, you need a car. Okay, now I need a better car. Okay, I got a house. It's a great house. No, I need a bigger house. I need a fancier house. We're kind of like, and the American culture sort of does that to us. I call it chasing happiness. So other parts of the world maybe don't have that as much. But yeah, I think that Maslow also said not many people reach self-actualization. I think Nelson Mandela is a really good example of someone who reached self-actualization. He took so many risks outside himself, right? He really transcended and reached full potential and affected others. That's another thing. You can't just be a great painter and sit at home and paint by yourself and not let anybody see it, right? You have to share it with others. But a lot of it's like a self theory as well, especially when we're talking about Rogers. Okay, so let's sort of move on here. Contextual theories, and sometimes these are called ecological theories. I have even seen Vygotsky put into the cognitive category. So I thought it was interesting that Feldman really put Vygotsky into the contextual theories category. But his theory was called the sociocultural theory. And then Urie Bronfenbrenner, his original theory was called the ecological systems approach. And then more recently it's been renamed the bioecological systems approach because we're adding in more elements of what we know about biology, right? Okay, so let's just take a quick peek at Vygotsky. Vygotsky said that culture and the individual, the child, constantly are interacting. The mentor, which in this case is the parent, is guiding the child, but not doing everything for her, but building a scaffold kind of alongside, and eventually as she gets more proficient at her skill, dad will back away and let her do it on her own. So the same thing like with a teacher. A preschool teacher will start out maybe starting the puzzle, or giving suggestions on where to move the piece, and then allowing the child to master the skill on her own. And once she's mastered the skill on their own, then you choose a harder puzzle, and you keep going out. You're working within the child's zone of proximal development. And language is also really important, because then the teacher or the parent is asking questions to guide them in their learning. So the social cultural cognitive theory, but then Feldman puts it in context. He has it in the contextual category, because we are really talking about settings, right? That's what contexts mean. We're looking at settings. And then the bioecological theory from Bronfenbrenner is a systems theory, right? So we function in systems. We have our, your close inner system would be your immediate family, right? Your parents, any siblings, or whoever you live with would be your microsystem. And I'll show a picture on the next slide. And then it kind of keeps extending in these systems that are, we can kind of look at them graphically like circles, and they expand out from there to the greater culture. And how do these things then interact, right? When you're very, very young, you kind of don't know anything except for your microsystem, maybe into your exosystem, macrosystem, maybe into like if you're going to preschool or friends' houses and that kind of thing. But you know, we moved from a town in Illinois to Washington when I was entering 4th grade. And when I went back to visit that town, probably maybe 15 years later, I didn't recognize anything except for my street that I lived on and the way I walked to school. So I mean, you're not really aware of much outside of your inner system until you get older, until you're, you know, so that's where the chronosystem time is important in starting to realize these different systems here. So services, exosystem, you know, your neighbors, your friends, but then the macrosystem is the attitudes or ideologies of the greater culture. Okay? So those things are kind of embedded in everything that we do, but they do work in this sort of coordination of the system. And then the evolutionary perspective, of course, Charles Darwin, we've got natural selection and survival of the fittest. We are the way we are today because of you know, the reproductive success of our ancestors. They were able to pass on their genes, and the strongest survive, and then those qualities, those traits, have endured. Konrad Lorenz is a slightly more recent researcher, 20th century, you know, as opposed to 19th century. And his theory was an ethological perspective. He really felt that there were certain critical periods in development that things needed to be captured in order for that development to continue. So here he's with his geese, okay? The geese hatch, and they see him instead of mama goose, mother goose, and they imprint onto him. And so there's all these photographs of him walking around his farm, and they're following him, and he's swimming in the lake, and they follow him just like they would follow their mother, right? So he said, well, this is an instinctual thing that has come as a product of evolution of that species. It's not really a learned behavior, right? It's instinctual. Right when they're born, they will imprint after whoever is there. And so he said this can apply to humans as well. We have critical periods or sensitive periods where learning occurs, and then development progresses from there. So, and then I couldn't help but I have to put in the eclectic perspective, because most contemporary psychologists take a little of this, a little of that, stir it up, mix it up in your own pot, do what you want with it, right? Borrow from other people, maybe write your own theory. But this whole thing of which is the right theory, which is the best theory, that's where maybe as young adults you're going through this new way of thinking. Maybe you're having a cognitive shift and starting to understand that there isn't a right theory or a wrong theory. They are perspectives, and most people take, bits and pieces from various ones. I always get a little bit nervous when I go to, say, a preschool, and they say very adamantly that they are maybe they'd say, well, we're a Montessori school, and we absolutely follow the Montessori philosophy. We would call that a purist, where they purely focus on that one theory, and they don't vary from it. And they're very proud of that. It's like, okay, well, that's great. And I think Montessori programs are very good. But I think that it's maybe not always practical going from that to public kindergarten that's a different system and has different expectations. And they expect those kids to be at a certain level entering kindergarten. So then, as a parent in the 21st century, you go, okay, well, how do I want my kid to develop? Maybe Montessori is a great way to develop. But maybe I like some of these ideas from Piaget in the child exploring. But let's throw in some Vygotsky and get a little bit more teaching involved, right? Because Montessori was really hands-off. She really said, let the child explore on her own, on his own. Don't make them do anything, right? Well, you start kindergarten, they make you do a lot of stuff, right? They expect a lot. So there's too much of a switch, right? So I want my kids to go to a preschool that's probably more eclectic. It's funny, Camden went to one called Montessori, and they didn't know, of course, they didn't know that I taught lifespan psychology or knew anything about psychology or child development. And I went in there and I was looking around, and it wasn't really a Montessori school. I mean, they had some of the ideas from Maria Montessori, but it was really eclectic. And so I signed them up. I thought, well, this is good. They're taking what they like from Montessori. They're taking what they like from probably, the Snohomish and Everett Public Schools, and they're stirring it up, and they're making it their own program. And it was good, Okay, so we're going to do an activity here. I want to talk just a little tiny bit about resilience and see how we can take some of these theoretical perspectives and start analyzing and thinking about questions as they relate to a particular topic. How do you define resilience? What is resilience? What does that mean?
The ability for something to return from the previous state.
Okay, the ability to return. So literally, if we're talking about this chair is resilient. I bang on it and it's plastic, it's kind of bends and then it pops back, right? Yes?
Being able to bounce back from a trauma that might be in your life or something that happens to you, you're able to overcome that challenge and go back to your prior state.
Okay, so now let's take that definition that was very literal and apply it to something that happened to a person, and they bounce back, literally bounce back after some traumatic thing to their past state of being or current state of being. Yeah, Daniel? Overcoming adversity. Okay, good. So something happens, something traumatic, some kind of circumstance puts the child at risk or the individual at risk, and potentially harm them psychologically or physically, right? Now, the younger the person is, the more resilient they are, right? Go back to plasticity in the brain. The brain is very, very plastic in the first 3 years of life because you're laying down neural pathways. You haven't set things down in stone where, and then nothing's ever set in stone, right? But it's just harder to rearrange pathways the older and older you get. A newborn infant has the receptors in their brain to hear every single phenome that the human voice makes, right? So a phenome is a sound bite. So every single sound that can come from the human voice box, that newborn infant can hear up until about 6 months old. But if they do not hear a phenome in whatever the language system is that's being presented to them, they will lose the capacity to hear that sound again. So it's kind of amazing. You've got this massive dendrite growth going on, and at the same time pruning, which is the sort of like trimming away of dendrites. So you have fewer pathways, and then the pathways that are important really start getting laid down, which would be like, in our family, the English phenome system. So there are sounds that then later, if say you try to take that language when you're older, you have difficulty pronouncing them because you can't really hear them. There's some languages that have a sound. We don't have that in English. And it's hard. It's hard to learn. So your brain hasn't laid that down yet. Getting back to resilience, if you have something happen very, very early in life and pruning hasn't occurred yet, or you haven't had pathways laid down yet, your brain will work around it. They'll work around the injury if it's something physical happening, or if it's something traumatic, your brain can bounce back faster, easier. Maybe we don't have, also because we don't have very, very early memories, right? So maybe if something happened to you when you were little, before age 3, it may not have much effect on you if you were removed from the situation and put in a nurturing environment. It might not have an effect on you at all, really. So how it relates to developmental psychology, kind of like take a look at neurons here. All right, you have a traumatic event take place. You have a prolonged alarm reaction in your nervous system. And in a deprived situation, so here's a neuron, right? The large part there is the cell body, and you've got all these dendrites branching out. And in a deprived situation, you have lack of growth, right? So if the child is emotionally neglected, or of course physically abused, they're not getting an enriched environment to allow for brain growth. In the enriched environment, we see lots of dendrite growth, lots of flourishing, right? What's really scary is look at the actual brain size. These are scans, obviously blown up on my slide here, but this is a 3-year-old, samples of 3-year-old children, a normal developing child, and so we have the child with extreme neglect. They actually have like microcephalia, small head, small brain. And even though the brain is very plastic, that is going to be hard to recover, right? Yeah, Ashley?
It's kind of similar to what we learned in Psych 100, where they talk about, for instance, if you have a traumatic event, like you fear something for a long period of time, and you haven't responded to that fear, like you haven't overcome that fear, is that kind of the same thing?
Like if you have post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, kind of like, for instance, someone who maybe you grew up and you had, something bad happen to you, like a car accident or something. So every time you see an intersection where the car accident happened, you have a fear that that's going to happen again because the stimuli, you haven't responded to it from that first time.
Like you get fixated on it. That's a little bit like PTSD. Or you're triggering that memory, that response, and then you have the continued experience, possibly. Yeah.
I can answer her question because that happened. Someone senior in my I got branded for that, and for the first 3 weeks after it happened,
So anytime somebody has something traumatic happen to them like that, obviously the goal is to try to reteach your brain, right? Relearn that, and hopefully not have it manifest into PTSD, right? We don't want you to have to go through that. If it's a young child and we get them out of the environment or get early intervention to try to take advantage of the plasticity of the brain so that they can recover. They're going to have this greater resilience in overcoming whatever they've been through. So, you know, for an adult, something happens, you've got a lot to fall back on, right? You've got a lot of really good pathways, and your brain is pretty mature in your frontal lobe. Your executive functioning is there, so you can hopefully work through, you know, the trauma of your car accident and not get to that point. Someone younger developmentally that doesn't have that executive functioning and understanding that, okay, not every single time I get in the car, there's potential for a car accident, they might, you know, withdraw, right, even more. So then you as the parent or the adult want to, you know, make sure that we're not, you know, having that happen where they continue to experience trauma, right? Priscilla, did you have a question?
Oh, no, I was just going to add to that, because when I was 16, I got in a car accident too. It was really bad when the car caught on fire.
Oh my gosh.
And I had to take the driver out of the car because there was no paramedic, no rescue, or anything in the car on fire. So all this crap happened. Long story short, you know, for a couple of years after, I'm 20 now, it was traumatizing. I would, you know, go to bed at night and hear like the screaming, or, you know, when I pulled him out of the car, I would remember the car catching on fire.
Oh yeah.
You know, those traumatic events, but as time goes on, it's over.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it was for the first year or two that I would remember that, and I couldn't really sleep at night. But then after that, it's like your brain kind of, you know, now when I get in a car with somebody else driving, I don't trust them, so I might get a little bit paranoid, but it's nothing compared to what it was
Right.
when I was 16. So
Right.
it's come a long way.
Well, and because you've created more new associations, that was a highly individualized event that happened to you, and you know, what's the likelihood of that happening? You understand that was, you know, unique, and so you've now made new associations, and your amygdala, which is the emotional response in your brain, isn't getting hyperactivated with every single thing that you do or every time you get in the car. And so even as adults, our brains are incredibly resilient to, you know, overcoming adversity. And I think that's pretty cool. You know, you go, wow, okay, first 3 years of life, pretty darn important. Look at this. We can see the evidence. But that doesn't mean that, you know, it's hopeless. That's why that notion of critical period versus sensitive period, we're like, you know, gosh, people have had some pretty terrible brain injuries and overcome them. And so does that mean that critical period is, you know, oh, you didn't learn how to walk in the critical period, so does that mean you're never going to learn how to walk? You know, like say the child was really, really sick. You know, most kids learn to walk. You don't have to teach them how to walk. It's part of their, you know, it's just an expectant thing that their brain growth is going to make those pathways, and they're going to start to pull up and take steps. Yeah, they might have models at home, older siblings, but you don't have to have the model. They will still do it. So child is sick or injured and can't walk during this so-called critical period. Now they're over 2 years old. Okay, we're outside maybe some of this window, so you may have to go to physical therapy. You take the child to physical therapy, you work with the child. You don't have to work with a normal developing, typical developing toddler, right? They just learn how to walk. But you've gone past that sensitive window. I like sensitive period better than critical period. You're going to need more help. but the brain is very plastic, and they will create the pathways, and they can do it. You know, you could be 40 years old and learn how to swim. It's going to be a lot harder than if you were 4 years old, right? And so that kind of all relates when we're talking about things that might happen throughout the course of development. Yeah?
That slide there with the extreme neglect, that was purely from neglect, that change in size of brain matter?
Right. It was, I believe this was from, I grabbed this off of a study where they were looking at children who were not abused but just neglected, like they were in crowded orphanages where they were put in cribs, and just and the nurses, there were too many babies for the nurses to hold them all, so they weren't held, they weren't given affection, they weren't touched by other humans. They were they could see and hear all the other babies in the room, but they had extreme neglect, and they had this stunted brain development.
Did you mention whether it had anything to do with cortisol levels?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And so, their cortisol is spewing out all over the place, right? Because they're, it's like they're hypervigilant all the time. And there's some pretty interesting studies that we'll talk about probably in a few weeks, where some children who naturally have higher cortisol levels, just maybe part of their DNA, you put them in a new situation, they take a saliva sample from the child, put them in a new situation, and boy, you can just see that temperament it's just coming out in them, and they have a hard time responding to the researcher, doing the activity that they're doing. And it's really neurological, and in those cases, that maybe is something that the child was born with. This has sort of been created, right? This is because of the environment. So that's, again, where we get back to that important interaction between nature and nurture. I get really fascinated in resilience when you see children thriving and going above and beyond the expectations, but it's not largely studied. We know a lot about the ones that don't thrive because they're the ones that are left in the hospitals or in the homes or seeking therapy. We often don't study the ones that thrive because they're out in the world doing well, and so we don't know as much about them, unless it's like something that ends up becoming, a news story, like there was the story of, I can't remember her name now, Elizabeth, that she was homeless. Her parents were drug addicts, and she was homeless, and she slept in the janitor's closet at her high school and didn't let anybody know, and she got all the way to Harvard. But when you look at that case study, you look back at her early childhood, she was not neglected or abused in the first few years of life. So she had her very important brain structures in place, and her parents didn't become drug addicts until she was 5 or 6 years old, and then she had a grandmother, so she had a protective factor, a support system, and it wasn't until she was older that these other things happened. So anytime you read those case studies, you always go back and go, well, what happened the very, very, very early years of life? Because we see here how it's so important on the brain. And we're out of time.